Thank you, Dr. Qureshi. It's always a pleasure to be back in this room, to be with the American Pakistan Foundation. I've had my own affiliation, and a small plug. We were talking about fellowships. There is one between APF and the Asia Society as well coming up this summer. I recommend you look that up if you're interested in South Asia policy and get a chance to work with me. I'll be very happy to play a little role in the development of our community. And but here we are quite ready to talk about something that's close to all of our hearts, which is foreign policy and how our identity as South Asians has shaped the way we approach foreign policy and our roles in here in the United States, particularly looking at the region, but elsewhere. I'm joined by two fantastic speakers, Maryum and Ameena, one who has over 2 decades, almost, more or less, of experience in foreign policy, another relatively new, but I'm sure it's substantial. But just because we are limited by time, and this could be a conversation that could go on forever, and I would love to catch you both later and just talk about our experiences, but I want to know from the both of you, how did your identity as a South Asian kind of made you approach this work of foreign policy? Was it an area of interest because you were passionate about it, or as a South Asian, you did not see many of us in these capacities before? So what was the motivation, and how did your identity play a part in sort of promoting the work that you're doing? But also at the same time, I realize that it doesn't come without its challenges. So we'd be very happy if you could shed light on that. So if we start with you, Maryum, and come to you then, Ameena.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think Naima really set the stage well with the quote, "This too shall pass," because, and actually when she was saying this, and we're both at the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster, I think we can say the least, the last year, but also even before that, is that speech, Abraham Lincoln borrowed it right before the Civil War. So this is sort of we're at an inflection point. I started my career sort of decades, I think, after Ameena. In some ways, I started as a Peace Corps volunteer in Jordan, and it was right after September. It was actually during September 11th when the attacks happened, and I had planned to do medicine like everyone else in our family. My mom is a physician. She grew up in Hyderabad in India, actually. And her long line of that was the track. And then when 9/11 happened, the world sort of shook for me. I was in Jordan, sitting in a village, and watching the towers fall. My parents were in Texas. I was worried about their safety, as brown Muslims in Texas after all the post 9/11 backlash. They actually, my dad joked with me. He's like, "Maryum, they all think we're Mexican here anyway, so don't worry about us," and they were more worried about me. And so, but then it made me really realize, there aren't people who look like me in foreign policy circles back then. And so when I sort of pivoted then, I didn't realize I'd be pivoting, did AmeriCorps after the Peace Corps, worked in post 9/11 anti-immigrant backlash with an organization connected to Pramila Jayapal, who's now in leadership, right? So that was about 20 years ago, and joined the Foreign Service and started my career in 2010, right at the beginning of the Arab Spring. So I started in Cairo, and for me, the power of identity was being invisible, actually. Like the fact that I was brown and sort of blended in Egypt meant that I would show up at the protests. I was in Cairo, in Tahrir, when Mubarak, before Mubarak fell, and I could blend in a way that I think actually was a superpower in some ways. It could seem like being invisible is not necessarily a positive, but and being a diplomat, it gives you access in a way, right? People tell the truth. People are more candid with me in the room, and I would notice with other colleagues, and Ameena might feel the same way as having just started. You learn different things. So I think there is something about being on the periphery of power. In this case, in some ways we're getting closer to more proximity to power through breaking ceilings in different industries. But I think there is something to be underestimated, can actually be something that we can use to our advantage. So I found that to be something, and also the fact that having, sort of this hybrid identities and cultures makes you, I think, more curious, actually. And sometimes you face adversities, and that those adversities actually make you more creative in some ways. So not to romanticize inequity, but I will say that I've had to be a little bit more resourceful than maybe some of my other colleagues where things are sort of just inevitable for them.
Assalamualaikum, everyone. Wow. Okay. I apologize in advance if I sound sick. I am from Texas. Also, like Maryum, I had no idea either. And the New York cold yesterday took me out. But anyways, I also, my parents are from Lahore, Pakistan. They immigrated around 30 years ago and they came to San Antonio, Texas. And just like what Maryum said, most people assumed that we were brown Hispanic and not brown Desi. So I remember being in elementary school and like having to take ESL courses to improve my English. And it was because of, Urdu and Punjabi being my first language and not Spanish. So that was a very interesting time. But kind of, going off of what Naima also said, I didn't really fall into diplomacy easily. I think it was something that, was not talked about often at all. I grew up in a first generation low income family in Texas, and my father's dream for me was for me to become a doctor. And so my entire life, like when I was younger, my dad would tell me the OBGYN that took care of your mother when she was pregnant with you was named Ameena. And so we named you Ameena so you could become a doctor, which is crazy pressure to be raised with. So I was like, okay, like if you guys really want me to be a doctor, in high school, I became an EMT. I took all these classes and competitions in medicine. And I really wanted to leave Texas because I felt like it was a bubble of its own. And alhamdulillah, I got a full ride scholarship to Dartmouth, which really helped just open up my worldview. I didn't know a lot about political science. All I knew was that politics was pretty bad in Texas. And so it wasn't something that I should really pursue. And growing up as well, my dad always used to have a very negative perspective on politicians, probably because of his experience or watching news in Pakistan. He'd always be like, oh, ye mardo ka kaam hai. Like this is not, politics is a man's world. Women don't enter it. Women should not be a part of it. It's dirty work. And so I think with a lot of that bias and stereotype in mind, I knew that I liked keeping up with news, but I was like, this is not my world. I'm just going to continue doing medicine and maybe incorporate anthropology and social sciences into my life and make it more like global health, where I can learn about the world and regions while still having health as my background. And then senior year at Dartmouth, I was applying to fellowships, and just kind of on a whim without telling my family, I applied to the Wrangell and Pickering fellowships, which for those who don't know, those are just pipelines into the Foreign Service. And I got both. And I reached out to some of my mentors and I said, this is giving me an opportunity to like really go far away from medicine. I don't know if I should do this or not. I don't know how my family will take it. And I talked about it a little bit. And the first thing my dad said, he was like, we sacrificed so much for you. We left Pakistan to come to the US. And now you're telling me that you want to work in countries like Pakistan again and like leave the comforts that we've given you. And I remember kind of sitting with that question and reflecting on it and feeling like at that time it was going to be a good step for me. And, like Maryum said, it's relatively new for me. So currently I'm working as the political economic officer in Embassy Tashkent in Uzbekistan. I'm also the human rights officer. And the work is hard, especially with what is going on in the world. But it is still very rewarding in and of itself because it gives you access and it gives you confidence in a way that I have this expertise. I'm the expert matter on labor now in Uzbekistan and in Central Asia. I'm the expert matter lead on human rights issues. I've gotten to talk to activists in Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan who have faced police brutality. So those kinds of experiences I would have never gotten had I not chosen this field and how it kind of fell into my lap. And so I'm really grateful for that, but it's hard. I'm not going to gloss over it. I remember when I first joined the Foreign Service, I asked somebody, so like, where are the hijabi women? Like who can I have as a mentor who looks like me? And nobody had any answer for me. I didn't know anybody who was Pakistani American who was a diplomat, who wore the hijab, what kinds of issues they faced in other countries. And I still really don't. Like, I think there's like one or two other women who wear the hijab who are also diplomats. And so trying to create that community through that. But it's very hard. I mean, I work in the classified section in the embassy, and I've been stopped numerous times because people think that I'm the local staff. So a local Uzbek, and they ask me, oh, are you sure you have top secret clearance? Like, are you sure you're allowed to be behind these doors and be in classified areas and have access to classified information? So just experiences like that, they kind of remind you that there are not a lot of us in this field and not a lot of people in foreign policy. But I really hope that, our voices become more outspoken, and a lot of Pakistanis join the Foreign Service and foreign policy because it's very much needed.
Thank you very much for those extremely profound reflections on what you said, Maryum, about that cloak of invisibility becoming superpower. Sometimes that's what you need, and that you kind of work with the toolkit you have. And to your point, Ameena, about how do you navigate jumping through the pressures that you have in a particular standard brown family, which I did too, to become a doctor. God knows how many times I jumped courses, but you also mentioned something which is largely seeing yourself in what is considered to be a man's world, and yet we have 3 women here speaking on foreign policy. I think that's a change in itself, which I'm very proud of. And young, if I may add, but it is this begs the question that from the time both of you started, 20 some years for you, Maryum, relatively later than that for you, Ameena. How has the landscape shifted? Are you seeing the needle moving in the right direction, where there are positives, there are openings for people as you welcome them into foreign policy and foreign service? Do you think the barriers that you once faced, they're coming down a bit and creating new openings? Maryum, and then Ameena.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen an evolution. 5 years ago, right after the first Trump administration and kind of right before Biden's term, there was sort of a need for more organizations that focus on pipeline development into public service, right? So we were all pressured to do medicine, but then some sort of went against the grain, many in the room, into doing other things, right? And especially public service. I think for me, in the shadow of September the 11th, coming of age, then that was the catalyst. That if we're not at the table, we'll be for dinner or whatever it is. That saying. It's like if we're not part of this. And so 5 years ago, I co-founded a group called Muslim Americans in Public Service, and it was really mainly focused on the federal workforce. And I had just been brought back in. I'd done a fellowship with the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'd taken a sabbatical for a year. Didn't think I was going to come back into government. And then when Biden came in and there was a whole push towards modernization, but with the focus on inclusion and like who's at the table, we co-founded Muslim Americans in Public Service. And I ended up working for the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the State Department. The beauty, I will say, about the career for anyone interested, maybe now is not the perfect time to join, I would say, but I think in the future, yes, is that you're always reinventing yourself. So I was in Cairo on the front lines of Tahrir doing exchange programs with Fulbrighters. In Baghdad, I worked on with Iraqis. I was such a privilege to be able to interview Iraqis who had served with the U.S. military, risked their lives through the special immigrant visa process. And then, I reinvented myself to focus on sort of detoxifying the institution I was in, which was essentially, making it more equitable for everyone. And I think that was something I've seen, for example, assignment restrictions. That's a very concrete thing. People of certain backgrounds might have been barred in the Foreign Service from serving in those countries. Like if somebody who is of Chinese origin, there could have been biases that were baked into the process. One thing we worked on when I was in that office, when we first started, was just looking at that to say, well, why are we doing this? Does this make sense? Is this discriminatory against people who have Muslim sounding names or Arab? We collected data. We did a demographic baseline for the first time in U.S. history or in State Department history or federal government, where we then published it. We did the baseline and then we published it not just internally, but externally. I think we're the only federal agency to do so. Of course, now we're in a different moment. The pendulum is swinging in a very different direction. But I think those foundational pieces of understanding who's at the table, even, with Muslims, it's not a racial category, but then it's an identity category that is racialized, right? If your name is Ahmed and whatever background you're from, you may face biases and discrimination. So we started to figure out within the State Department, how do we measure some of these obstacles? And then through data analysis and barrier analyses, how do you fix it, right? And from a very sort of more quantitative and concrete way. And so we worked in that direction. Again, pendulum is moving in another direction. But I think some of the muscle memory that we gained in those improvements then, we'll be using them. And I think they're still relevant. And I think especially whenever this too shall pass moment passes, we'll need to figure out how to really kind of resurrect that muscle memory to move forward, because that's kind of the only way forward. And I think the exciting part now is that you see people across industry, as Naima mentioned, in everywhere, in film and painting, in arts. And I know I served in Lahore, so for me it was amazing when their parents of their, my parents were like, go to medicine. Why did you do diplomacy? What is that? To people in Lahore, actually, I loved. They were like, I want my kid to be a journalist. I want my kid to be an artist because of the National College of Arts. And so for me, that was actually a learning experience of. It's not always the diaspora that sort of I mean, our parents came, as mine at least, immigrants for economic opportunities. And so it's interesting to see the global perspective for me was going to Pakistan and seeing a different view actually of what career options could be. And maybe that was a very Lahore kind of focused thing. But yeah, things have changed. Things will change. Nothing is static. And I think we all have to be kind of contributing in whatever areas of industry that we're in to sort of chip away and make things sort of more inclusive and more really humane, to be honest, in this world of, where our humanity is being tested day in, day out, just to be better. Thank you, Maryum. Briefly.
Yes. Thank you, Maryum, for making space for us. I think from a Gen Z perspective, I feel like a lot of I hear my supervisors at the embassy being like, back in my day, we would get yelled at, and like some of our supervisors would like throw things at us, and now you have it so much better. And I'm like, wow, thanks, which is really sad. The bar was so low. So things like that don't happen anymore in the embassy. And if they do happen, then you have avenues to report that and all of that. But I think something that gives me hope or is really inspiring from my generation and young diplomats that have entered into the Foreign Service is that they're very vocal. They're very vocal now, and they know what they want, and they know how much they're willing to put up with, and what is like their line, their boundary. So I think that has been really refreshing to see. Same here, what your moral compass is, what your values are. And if you feel like what is happening or the work that you're doing is not aligning with that, and you're being asked to sacrifice certain things of yourself, they speak up. And I think that's super important, because a lot of times in diplomacy, like, what does a diplomat do? You're kind of in like the back end of doing policy making and action. And maybe it's better for you to be silent or like put up with it this time. But I think what is really inspiring for me is just Gen Z speaking up, calling out what is wrong, and standing up for what is right, even when it may cost them a good assignment, position, promotion, because that's really what we need. That is how change will happen.
Thank you very much to the age of empowerment through freedom of speech. And of course, one thing that I want to add, because we've reached the end of our session, and I'm on the clock here to conclude, but I do want to add that being a South Asian in this industry, in this field, it's also a lot of responsibility. So as you walk through the doors, you sit down and, craft policies or help craft policies, it's a lot of responsibility how you carry yourself, what you add to the table, and always trying to be at the table and not at not on the menu. Shout out Marcani. But thank you very much. This has been an incredible audience. Thank you very much, both
Thank you.
Maryum
Thank
and
you.
Ameena for this. Please catch them later if you have more questions. Right.